How's that? Can you hear me? Good evening, everyone. My name is Carol Shankrick, and I'm the chair of the Park West School Division Board. On behalf of the board, I would like to welcome everyone here this evening. This has been a really challenging budget for us, so we're really looking forward to your input on this proposed budget. So with that being said, without any further ado, I will call up our Superintendent, Stephen David, to start the sharing of our proposed budget. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Just so you know, I'm not checking the Maple Leafs score, even though I know they're losing 1-0 to Tampa Bay. I'm checking two things. I'm checking Facebook. I'm really impressed and surprised by the turnout because only 5 of you confirmed on Facebook, which is the way people confirm attendance now. And I don't see Tanis Chesley, so now I'm worried about her because she confirmed that she was coming and she isn't here yet. The other thing I'm checking, and this is quite interesting, you could go to our divisional webpage, but if you go to YouTube and search for Park West School Division, you can see our presentation being live streamed, sort of live streamed. I think there's about a 10-second delay, is that correct? 10-20-second delay. So in addition just to being live streamed for anyone that's watching, and right now I'm looking, there's 15 people watching from home. I can tell you it's also archived there, so if there's anyone that you want to share it with, if you're representative of a town council, for example, and some of your colleagues aren't here, you could just suggest that they check out the video on YouTube. The additional thing I'll tell you is just prior to 7 o'clock, we uploaded the presentation to our divisional website. So if anyone, don't jump ahead, but the presentation is now available for you if you want to check it out. So the intent of this type of meeting is to give you the information up front, and the way it will work is I'll try to do some of the big picture stuff as well as the details, and then I'm going to call upon our Secretary-Treasurer, Darrell Fulton, and she'll go through all the math of it. She'll show you the total budget and funding from the province. She'll talk about the impact on property tax and commercial property and farmland and those kind of things. And she'll also talk about how the local levy is calculated. How's the volume? Some people are looking at me kind of strained. Can you hear me okay? All right. So I think in terms of big picture, 2 things I want to say. I find that one of the least effective ways to present these kind of things is to turn out a PowerPoint and read it line by line. So I want to say stuff and I'll be jumping around. I'm not going to read every slide word for word. I want to highlight some things. But what I'd suggest, if there's things that you have questions about, probably the best way to do it, unless it's for clarification, if you wouldn't mind just noting it and asking it at the end. So if it's just, what is that number for, you can ask and we'll provide some insight. But if you want to say, how come you're looking at reducing that and not this, that would be perhaps a question better left for the end. So, without further ado, whenever a school division talks about what they're going to budget for next year, whatever their plans will be for the next year, the hope would be that those plans and the budget reflects what your divisional priorities are. So these have been our divisional priorities for a couple of years, and much like we have them displayed here, they're displayed in our boardroom. So when we make decisions about important things like budgets and how we're going to spend our money, we hope that these divisional priorities help drive our thinking and help frame our mind in the way that we want it to be framed. For example, one of our key statements in the division is preparing the students for the world, and we try to live that in terms of some of the things that we plan and do in our schools. One of the unique challenges, and I'll say this straight up, I've been in the division now, this is my 16th year, and I think 8 years in the division office. For the first 4 or 5 years in the division office, we met for budget time and we talked about, hey, we get an extra $500,000 from the province. What do we want to do with the money? And that changed last year. So for about a 4-year period, there was a 0% increase in divisional budgets, but that was manageable because if you lost enrollment, it didn't hurt you. You still had the same money as the previous year. Last year, budgeting changed, and it's because the way schools have been funded publicly has changed. So last year, instead of a formula guarantee, which guaranteed us no less money than the previous year, we had 2% less. And that 2% less was sustained again this year, and there's some additional restrictions that made our budget a bit challenging. So I'm going to jump right in and talk about some of the things. So this just shows our enrollment by school and across the division projected for next year, and I think the key 2 to look at are the bottom 2. So the bottom 2 shows the projected, enrollment from this current year and our projected enrollment for next year. So one of the key things to note with this is our numbers have been very consistent. However, for next year, we're projecting a decrease of 28.5 students. That's significant because the average pupil cost for students in our school division is $12,600. So if you multiply 30 by 12,000, you get a quick sense of what the change in funding or the change in revenue is for a school division. The business of schools is student enrollment. The more students you have, the greater your funding. And as the enrollment decreases, you feel it in terms of budget. And that's of particular significance for First Nation students because unlike provincial students, for whom we get a guaranteed number, minus 2% each of the last 2 years, federal students or First Nation students, every student we get is more money. Every single student we lose is $12,000 less. That's the way it works. So these budget challenges, unfortunately, are no different than the challenges that we incurred last year. It's virtually the identical slide that I presented when we spoke. The interesting bullet to note is increased costs related to staffing. Other than the board, or raise your hand even as a board member, did anyone watch the funding announcement by Minister Wishart from Manitoba Education? So anyone that would have seen that, he talked about how this year was going to be a really great year for schools and school divisions because school divisions didn't have the pressure of salary costs. That's not true. This is the year, the final year of collective agreements for employee groups, and our employee groups had increases, a percentage increase 1.5% in September and in January. So for next year's budget, we had to develop a budget that had all our employees at their current salary level. The additional thing to note is in school divisions, teachers that are in their first 10 years get increments. You get a little bit more each year until you max out after 10 years. That's not a salary increase as per that Bill 28. That's currently in the hands of the government. So last year, you wouldn't recall this, but last year a salary increase for the school division, or wage side, was $586,000. So in a year, this year, in which Minister Wishart said school divisions will be well off because there's no salary increases, our salary costs are over $300,000 for next year. That's pretty significant. And they're fixed costs. They're not things that we can negotiate. They're built in. So I talked about this already, but it was a different, or it has been a different budgeting fiscal climate for us in the last 2 years than it had been previous. And unlike the first 13 or 14 years that have been in the division, it's not a year where, like last year, where we're talking about what are we going to add. And the problem with what we're talking about, and we don't take any of these things lightly, when we talk about reductions or cuts of programs in our school division, it's always been our perspective that we don't have anything extra. It's not like fluff. It's not things that we just wasted money on in a frivolous way. There were really important programs that we added, and now we're forced to rethink. And I guess the one thing I will say that was an overriding theme or area of focus for the board as they planned the budget this year was minimizing the impact on schools and classrooms. So what you're going to see is the majority of the reductions that we're going to be suggesting for next year and the changes in terms of the way we do things will be outside of the school. The fear of the board, not to make anyone panic, but if the trend of provincial funding continues, we're not sure what next year is going to bring. But the budget I'm going to share with you in a moment is what we hope is the best possible scenario, albeit one with some significant programming changes from what we've had previously. I feel like I've talked a lot without a breath. Anyone have any questions on the intro? Should have planted a couple of questions out there. No? Remember, write them down. We'll answer them all at the end. That's a good idea. It doesn't work when you point it not at the computer. Great suggestion. That's why Darrell has been such an instrumental part of the division for the last 2 years. Plus, she's a wizard with financial stuff. So the two big things for this year, I mentioned one of them already, was the 2% decrease in funding. Last year we had a 2% decrease in funding, the same in terms of provincial funding. And there was also a restriction placed on school divisions not to increase local taxation by more than 2%, the special requirement, which we'll explain later. And the final one was there was direction from the province about reducing management costs. And you would have seen that in health authorities last year. And in the last month, all the post-secondary institutions have been cutting positions and reducing costs. So they're the things that kind of framed our planning for this year. I pointed out the wrong thing. And the last bullet's really significant. Last year was a really tough budget. The starting point for us this year was that everything that we cut or reduced last year is not returning. So there's some really difficult ones for us last year. We cut programs like Career Trek, and we reduced the involvement of our schools in WE Day, and things that are really important to us. They're not in next year's budget either, unfortunately, because when faced with a 2% reduction plus all the fixed costs that were increasing, our starting point was, what are we going to reduce or cut? And that's not a fun way to budget. I can tell you, and this is an important point, we're doing a presentation tonight, next Thursday, because our timeline's been pushed back because of the late provincial announcement. We'll entertain anyone that wants to do a presentation to the board. Tentatively, we have it scheduled at 4:30 next Thursday, but we'll schedule it earlier if people are interested in coming out. It's not that we don't want to consult with you, but part of the job of the board and school division administrators, such as myself, is we have to get a plan for you as the public, and then we give you that for your feedback. And some school divisions will do things like asking principals, here are the 5 things we're considering cutting. What do you want to cut? I would never do that. The role of a school principal is to advocate for what they need in their school, and they really shouldn't be party to making decisions about what to cut. They can tell us what not to cut, but we shouldn't force them in a position where we tell them, tell us what to cut, and then later we say, we cut that because the principals want it. The difficult job of budgeting belongs to the school board and the divisional administration. And I think they did a great job, and we did a great job with an extremely difficult budget. So I'm not going to read this. This will be on the presentation. Check this out later. This is what we cut or reduced last year. So it was pretty significant. Lots of cuts in a variety of different areas, from programs to operations to staffing. Some of these things are little, and most of the things, a good number of the things from last year, a typical person wouldn't have an awareness of, because in some cases it was just a new administrative team and the board looking at our divisional budget line by line, finding ways we could find efficiencies and reduce. But a lot of things were pretty significant at a school level. I keep pointing at the wrong thing. So this is an interesting number. Last year, we added $313,000 to the budget. There was a fairly significant property tax hike, but we did it to combat the reduction in provincial funding. If you recall, and I'll show you in a moment, the local taxation increase was 6.9%. And the end result was us increasing, the wrong slide, but we increased expenditures last year by 313%. By total coincidence and fluke, our proposed budget for next year is suggesting a reduction of $313,000, which is a reduction of 1.1% in terms of expenditures. And here is the nitty-gritty of it. And again, I'm not going to go through it line by line, but please note anything that you have questions about and anything you want further explanation. There's proposed additions and proposed reductions. Some of the additions, the good number of additions, the majority of additions were fixed. There were things that, you know, if our maintenance supervisor said, we need another $15,000 for insurance for buildings next year, that wasn't negotiable. We had to do that. If our salary costs went up by $300,000, fixed, that's not a salary increase, but that's just meeting the current level, that was fixed. We couldn't do anything about the salary cost. So it's a crazy number. I'm not going to say anything else but that. To meet the goal of reducing by $313,000 with the additions that were required and a couple that we felt necessary, the total reductions, $961,000. That's a big number. Our divisional budget is $30 million, so that's almost $1 million. Fortunately, we offset those reductions by $650,000 in additions for the net $313,000. So for each of those categories on additions and reductions, there's a quick slide just to explain in bullet form what it is. Some of these things have much more detail, but I think for purpose of this meeting tonight, this will provide sufficient insight into what we're doing. So increased labor costs, that's what I've talked about already. And not to put it on poor Mr. Wishart or Minister Wishart, but he did say when he did the funding announcement that divisions would be well off and it wouldn't be a big problem because we had no increased staffing costs. That's our increased staffing cost. And that would be the same in the other 36 divisions across province. Obviously, the size of your division would determine the amount of the cost. We have a partnership with Wayway. Most of you are aware of Wayway Scapa First Nation. We have Education Director Colin Clearsky right here, as well as local trustee Brian Cloud. And they're all part of our division, and the Wayway budget is part of the divisional budget, but it's also separate because the money in for Wayway is spent on Wayway students. So there's a divisional budget of which a subsection is the Wayway budget, and the Wayway budget, we kind of call it Fund 1 for the division, Fund 3 for Wayway. So and this has even changed a little bit, and we're going to be talking about it on Thursday, but in the Wayway budget, they proposed an additional teacher to split a large class of grade 5s from 2 classes to 3 classes. And I just talked to Colleen very recently, and it may not be the case that that's in the budget anymore. But that is listed as a staffing cost. And the only staffing addition that we're proposing for next year is an ICT teacher leader. And what I can tell you is that teacher is full-time right now in her division. She was half-time. Her name's Leah Obach, and she's from Hemiota. And she's the teacher that works in classrooms with teachers and students, teaching them how to infuse technology into teaching and learning. And the board chose to make that position full-time for the whole year in January, and the proposal for next year has that in there as well. And this wasn't done without lots of careful consideration and discussion, but as you probably know, the division in partnership with 3 municipalities, we did a huge fiber optic network build, and we're looking to leverage that to help teachers maximize that resource to improve teaching and learning. The additional thing that we're well aware of is with our high schools getting smaller, this coming year we're going to be developing a plan to do increased distance learning, online learning, asynchronous learning. What that means is kids could be learning at different points in the same class, in the same subject area, with a teacher helping them, but using technology to work through the material. So we felt that was a very important addition. And I apologize. I said I wasn't going to read every slide, but these are significant ones, so I'm going to highlight most of the things. Repairs and maintenance. All our department heads come before the board during the budget planning, and they make an impassioned plea for the needs of their department. And that's the additional thing I can tell you. Last year, we weren't sure what the climate was going to be, so we basically told our supervisors, maintenance, transportation, ICT, 0 budget increase, plan for that. This year, we took a different approach, and we said, tell us what you need, make a case for it, and ultimately the board will make a decision about what we're going to do. So, for example, under repair and maintenance, Rodney Snow, our long-serving and very intelligent maintenance supervisor, came and told us he needed $87,000 more in operations. And he also needed a new, to him, but a used truck for his staff. We deliberated over those requests for a long time, and ultimately he got $50,000 increase and no truck. And again, much of what he's proposing in that $50,000 increase is a fixed cost. For example, we found out because there was 2 fires in schools in Manitoba in the last 18 months, our insurance costs go up $15,000 just for our division next year. They're the kind of things that we don't have much control over. The fiber co-op levy, that relates to the fact that we, in partnership with 3RMs, we took out a loan to build a fiber infrastructure. Initially, it was thought by the co-op that there would be no taxes on that loan because of the nature of organization. That wasn't the case. The one additional little complication, we had assumed and had hoped for a 30-year loan from our lender, and now it's looking like it might be a 25-year loan. So we had to adjust a little bit with their planning for that. What I can say is, does anyone in here have access to the fiber in their community yet? It's pretty incredible, and we're getting like way beyond what we had prior in terms of connectivity. And when you get it at a local level in your home, you'll notice the difference. Transportation department, the supervisor of that department also asked for an increase, and because we only increased, or we didn't increase the maintenance budget by as much as was requested, we had the same increase for the transportation director. And I say director, but it's the department in transportation. One of the things we often struggle with is the minister, and I'm not trying to be too critical, but he talks about how the focus should be in schools. and should be in classrooms, but I think we'll all acknowledge that school divisions require heat and lights and buildings and buses and all of those other things that aren't as sexy or as appealing as teachers and programs, but we have to plan for those things. So the transportation supervisor, for example, tells us every year about the aging fleet that we have for school buses and the need to improve our buses. And I mean, he's advocating for his department. This year he asked for 3 buses. We're able to give him 1 bus because we have to manage that with all the other things that are in our divisional budget. And some of these other things are just little things that maybe don't mean a lot, but we have to make sure we add them in. For example, IITV fees for Monarch. That's the new colony by Fox Warren. They only have 3 kids in high school. They don't have a high school teacher. Their high school students get their courses online from the parent colony back around Eli. And we have to pay their division for that fee. I mentioned the school bus. These are 3 budget areas where we had to add money to allow for us to make the purchase that we wanted. So for example, last year, we budgeted $105 for a bus. Buses cost $115. So next year we have to add another 10. We need to get back on track with our photocopier budget. We're adding an additional $10,000. And the last bullet is an important one, and I'll take some explanation. I think Jarrell will explain it a bit later. Last year, or this current school year, we added $173,000 to our surplus. Next year, we're suggesting we're going to add an additional $35,000. You can make the argument that why would you add to surplus if you have to do reductions in other areas? We don't have much of a surplus in our school division, unfortunately. So there's been some challenging budget years beyond just the provincial funding, and some of our surplus took a dent in the period about 10 years ago when for 4 or 5 years the division chose to almost go 0% increase every year because of some of the challenges that farmers were facing. So even though Mad Cow was back in 2005 or 6, the division had 5 or 6 years where we limited tax increases just not to impact farmers too much. And we've had some other unexpected pressures on our surplus, such as unexpected declines in First Nation enrollment and things like that, that have impacted our surplus. So we're not looking to build a big nest egg. A lot of people would recommend that a surplus for an organization such as a school division should be about 4%. On a $30 million budget, we should have $1.2 million in surplus. We're nowhere near $1.2 million. In fact, we're already taking cost-saving measures in our current budget to try not to spend our whole budget this year so as not to impact our surplus. Proposed changes. Every time I look at, all of them are significant. Every time I look at this first one, it kind of rocks me a little bit. And this is the one that we had a pre-meeting today with principals during the noon hour, and we told them about this one, and it's going to have a huge impact. So not to be melodramatic, but the division has invested considerable time, resources into developing our 4 flagship award-winning divisional vocational programs: cosmetology, building construction, healthcare aid, and the nature studies program that just started 2 years ago. Our draft budget, our proposed budget for next year, has those being removed, which is pretty significant. So we're not cutting paper budgets. We're not reducing expenditures in some software area. They're getting deeper this year, unfortunately, in terms of what we're proposing. So the original intent of these programs, the vocational programs, was to provide some equity and options for kids in our high schools that did not have vocational facilities, and they've had a tremendous impact. We have kids in the healthcare aid program that graduate from college before they graduate from high school. The building construction program is our longest serving one. It's been here for over 10 years in Bertle Collegiate. Dale Snyder, a former teacher, started it. Kids were building houses. The nature studies program, even though it's in only its 2nd year, had full-page features in the Brandon Sun and Winnipeg Free Press last year. And even more problematic, we just nominated in January for a provincial award for school board innovation. And one of the criteria for that school board innovation award was sustainability. So I actually had to contact the Manitoba School Board Association today to say, hey, remember that award we submitted last for the application? We may not have that program next year. Fortunately and graciously, they told us that lots of school divisions may be in the same boat as us this year, and they're not going to hold that against us, and they'll look at that application based upon where we were in January, which is fantastic. But on the off chance that we win that award, someone from our board will have to go up at the school committee conference and potentially accept the award for a program that we lost in our budget for next year. So none of these things are taken lightly. And the one that I didn't speak to was cosmetology. But cosmetology has been a fantastic program. Lots of kids getting all 3 levels of certification before they leave high school without a dollar out of pocket and just having to go into industry to become full-time hairdressers. The other problem with cosmetology is it's part of our partnership with Waywaskapo First Nation, and it's housed at Waywask School. So these program cuts that we're proposing for next year are pretty significant. And I apologize for taking a little bit more time to talk about this one, but they're all important. But these are ones that many people have been involved with the planning and development, and they're hugely significant. But the perspective of the divisional administration and the board when we were looking at the budget and doing our deliberations, this is a fantastic program. These programs 50 or 60 kids a year, but we had to minimize the effect on the 2,100 kids that are in all our schools, and that was our focus. Another 2.55 teachers, and I'm just going to skip ahead just to show you this. $220,000 in staffing costs for the vocational programs. But look at the top there. Also $133,000 in busing and materials. So when we looked at those divisional vocational programs, that's a big ticket item, $360,000. And that's why after several meetings over the last couple of weeks, we ultimately decided to put that in the proposed budget for next year as a reduction. 2.55 teachers due to decreased enrollment. If you recall from the first slide, we have 28.5 fewer students next year. So enrollment changes and staffing changes based upon enrollment. That's not a bad one necessarily. If you're in a school that has a reduction, that's not a good thing. But it's to be expected when your enrollment decreases that the staffing decreases. Speech and psychology, both being reduced by 0.15. We're taking advantage of the fact that we have teachers or staff in those positions on leave next year, and we're not going to replace them with full-time people for 1 year. And that's pretty significant. Like what it got to when we were doing the budget, we were looking for every dollar, every $1,000, every $5,000 increment we could find. So that reduction, and I can tell you it wasn't without painful discussion with our student services coordinator, that saves us $26,000 or $27,000 for next year. And finance position, because we were reducing staff divisionally with the vocational programs, because in our 15 schools collectively, there's 2.55 fewer teachers, we thought it was important that we took a reduction at the school division office as well, and there's a 0.5 position, which is actually a higher rate of reduction than the other ones, but we felt it was important. The interesting thing to note, I talked about the management, the 15% management thing, and I'm going to try these numbers, Drell, because I made a mistake and I misquoted them earlier today. Typically, school divisions are allowed around 4% of their total operating budget to be covered or to use for administration. Last year, the cap for our school division was 4.07. We actually had 3.32% of our budget was spent on administration. Good so far, right? With the 15% reduction, we have to go to 3.46 for next year, and we're going to be at 3.32. So we needn't have reduced anything in terms of management and administration because we're well below the plateau, but we just felt it important, and you'll see that in the next slide, that if we're asking for cuts and reductions in other areas, that the school division office has to model those things as well. Another big one, if there's any grade 6 teachers in here, I apologize. Across the office, or across the hallway from my office, there's a big picture from Parks Canada. About 7 years ago, we received an award from Parks Canada, and we received the annual National Ambassador for Parks Canada for the grade 6 outdoor education program that we developed. And for the past 8 years, I believe, every grade 6 student in our division, as part of their regular school program, would have a culminating activity, 2.5 days in Riding Mountain Park. That's being proposed as a cut for next year. In fact, if the budget is approved on March 8th, and I'll just say this and be upfront with it, if it's approved on March 8th that outdoor ed is not in the budget for next year, we're actually going to cut the program this year to save the money. Because even though it shows at $19,000, the actual expenditure for the outdoor ed education program is about $32,000. And I mentioned before we have pressures on our current surplus. So if outdoor ed is in next year, we won't do anything with it. But if it is cut next year, we won't run it this year either. And extracurricular trips, it's a 10% reduction in the money that we give schools for extracurricular trips. Other proposed changes. This is a unique one, and that's why I noted it. So before I talked about an additional $50,000 in the maintenance budget, but now I'm showing a reduction of the $178,000 in the maintenance budget. All of that reduction is on the Wayway side. So it's not offset with the $50,000 increase that I mentioned previously. And then all these other budgets just represent us going through our divisional budget line by line and finding areas that we could make reductions. And looking at trends from the last 5 years. So if for the last 5 years we spent $10,000 below in the superintendent department budget, let's budget it at $13,000 or $10,000 less. Many of these things don't have a direct impact on schools, but it's just we found another almost $300,000 in reductions, which prevented us from having to look at schools. I don't know what else to mention there. That might be it. I want to take a pause before I hand it over to Joel, if that's okay, and just ask any questions for clarification on any of those slides. You can raise your hand and say, on that slide you said this, or could you go back to this slide? Anything that you would like for clarification. Go ahead, Don. We have a half-time position in our building that we're not going to have next year. So one of the positions, and part of it, we met with staff today in the division office as part of an unfortunate tour that myself and John Zilke, the assistant superintendent, and Drill, in the last 4 or 5 school days, we've been going around meeting with people to tell them this, we're doing this in our proposed budget, it affects you directly. And I'll tell you that, I'll answer your question first, but just tell a quick aside. That's a position, that's a half-time position. We told staff about it. So it's not just it's cut and we're not doing that work anymore. It's cut, and if we go through with it in the budget, we'll then have to meet as a staff and decide who's picking up what responsibilities. And perhaps which responsibilities do you currently have that you're not going to do anymore because that finance stuff has to take priority. And I'll skip the story. Go ahead. Right, so the school-based cuts, the 2.55 on the school side because of enrollment, attrition will take care of it. In any given year, you have enough leave and people retiring or resigning to cover those kind of things. The vocational cuts are a little bit different. So for 2 of the vocational programs, people are cut just because of the nature of the programs. So the cosmetology program, we hired a cosmetology person from industry to do the program. She just started in January to replace the person before her, and John met with her on Thursday. And I'll tell you how difficult this has been. I'm not looking for any sympathy, but John emailed his teacher and said, hey, can I come drop by tomorrow? I'm in the area to have a chat. And her response, and John came to see me right away, is, I can't wait to see you. I got lots of ideas about how to build a program. That was a tough conversation. The other one, just 1 second, Brian, the healthcare aid people, there's 2 of them, 2 nurses that work in this building. They're hired by ACC, but we pay for them. There's no healthcare aid program. They don't have a job. But you also have to understand the trickle-down effect. So Birtle Collegiate, and the principal is here, the new principal. After we did the public budget meeting, we still needed to cut a little bit deeper. Birtle Collegiate lost another quarter teacher on the night of the final budget decision last year. So on last Wednesday, I had to come first meet with the principal, Birtle Collegiate, and say, we're losing those vocational programs in your school, potentially in the proposed budget. The people that do them now have to be in your regular school staffing. And then the third level was, and because of that, 1 person in your building can't be here next year. And that's a permanent staff member we'll find a job for, but then I had to meet with that permanent staff member and tell her, because of this, it's likely that you're not going to be here next year. So that's the type of discussion that we've had. Sorry, Brian, you had your hand up. It's interesting. I'll go to you right away, Colleen, but I called Colleen last week to tell her about the cuts to the program, and right away we started talking about whether the program could run in a different way as part of the partnership next year. Go ahead, Colleen. Outdoor education? Oh, that's a good point. So we've done that now for 15 minutes, and I realize that the 15 or 16 of you that are showing or viewing at home may not hear the questions. I think I'm answering them fairly well, but I'll restate them from here on in. So Colleen Claresky just mentioned two things, that the cosmetology program may be sustained as part of the partnership with Park West, and they're also looking at outdoor education. So any questions, I apologize, good suggestion, Tanya, or comments from the audience, I'll make sure to rephrase. There's going to be lots of time for questions at the end. What I'll say is we'll stay as long as you have questions tonight. And it needn't be the whole group. If people just want to stay for conversation, myself and divisional administration and the board would be willing to do that. Any other questions for clarification before I turn it over to Darrell? Yes. Yep. That's a good point. So Colleen, the director of education from Huawei, just talked about how perhaps if the school division and the First Nation had talked about the school division budget, perhaps some of the things that we're presenting tonight could be a little bit different. And that's a good thing to say because the budget is not confirmed and doesn't need to be passed for a week and a half. So there's still time for lots of discussion, not just at a divisional level, but from a community level. So I am encouraging you to go back and reflect and think about what I've told you already and what Darrell will share with you. And we want to hear from you. You don't have to come and make a presentation. You can phone and talk to me. You can send an email. You can give us perspective any way you want. The board wants to have as much information to help inform their decision as possible. Come on up, Darrell.
Okay, so I'll just take a few minutes to talk about our budget from a big picture. So all the changes that Stephen talked about are reflected on this slide, which shows our expenditures by function. So that means spending area this year compared to next year's proposed budget. So as you can see, our total budget of about $29 million, over half of that is spent on regular instruction. It's the $16.9 million you see at the top. That's largely our in-class teachers. The next line, making up more than 10% of our budget, student support services. So these are our EAs, our guidance counselors, resource teachers, our clinicians, which are our speech language pathologists, and our psychologists. The next two lines, adult education and early childhood, those are expenditure items on the Wayway side. There's an adult ed campus at Wayway, and early childhood, that refers to grades prior to kindergarten. Wayway School has a nursery school. Then approximately 3% of our budget, as Stephen mentioned, spent on divisional admin. And I should mention these are all costs that include both salaries as well as goods and services. Curriculum, so this is mostly our numeracy, literacy facilitators, as well as our ICT facilitator. Library professional development for the whole division, we're proposing to spend about $300,000 next year. Transportation makes up roughly 6% of our total budget. Maintenance, roughly 10% of our total budget. Fiscal, that's our payroll tax and interest charges that we pay on our line of credit. And then capital items of 363, as Stephen explained, that's our school bus, our proposed addition to our surplus of $209,000 next year, and photocopiers of about $40,000. I'll just take a minute to talk about our revenues by source, excluding the revenues from local taxation. So you can see here, we're expecting to see a decrease in our revenues by about $500,000. So we're expecting revenues of $18.5 million from the province, which is down 2% over the previous year. And the other big chunk of our revenues, other than local taxation, is from tuition from First Nation students. We're also expecting that to be down next year due to decreased enrollment. So overall, expecting a 3% decrease, or about, like I said, $500,000 decrease in revenues before local taxation. So now we get on to the special requirement. So this is the money that we need to raise from local taxation in order to balance our budget. So the way we get to this number is we start with our budgeted expenditures of $29 million, less our revenues from other sources of $18.5 million, to get to the amount we need to ask local taxpayers for, about $10.5 million in 2018-19, which represents a 2% increase over last year, or over the current year, 17-18. And that 2% was capped by the province for us. That was a maximum that we could ask this year in the special requirement. So I'll just talk a little bit about how the special requirement is different from the special levy. Because I'll show you in a moment that the special levy increase we're going to be asking for is 4%. It's the special requirement that was capped by the province at 2%. So the difference is that the special requirement is based on our fiscal year, which runs July to June, whereas the special levy, which is collected by municipalities, is based on the calendar year, January to December. So this slide shows how we go about calculating the special levy. We start by taking 56% of last year's special requirement, add to that 44% of this year's special requirement, and that's how we get 10.3 or 10.4 rounded is our special levy for Park West School Division for 2018. So there you can see on the top of the slide the 10.4 million that I just showed on the last slide. So that's the special levy for Park West School Division. We also need to raise taxes on behalf of the DSFM, that's the French School Division in Manitoba. And this year that amounts to $348,000 that we need to raise on their behalf, less about $800,000 tax incentive grant which we get from the province, which brings us to our total special levy. Remember, the levy is calculated over the calendar year of $9.9 million. This represents an increase of about $382,000 over last year, or 4%. I'm just going to skip ahead. I'll go back. So this slide shows the history of our special levy at Park West School Division. There's 4% on the bottom, which I just explained how that's calculated. And as Stephen mentioned, last year, our special levy increase was 6.9%, which was the highest in the last at least 10 years. Okay, so now I'll just take a few minutes to talk about how to calculate your education taxes. So to do that, we take the assessed value of your property, multiply that by the portion that is taxed, which is different depending on the type of property you own. It's 45% if you're a residential property owner, 26% if you're a farmland owner, or 65% if you're a commercial owner. There were varying levels of assessment increases in 2018, with farmland seeing the highest increase in property assessment of 24%. So some people like to know what the mill rate is. I remember I got that question last year. So the way the mill rate is calculated is we take the special levy, there's that 9.9 million we talked about, divide that by the total assessed value of all the property in the division, which is up considerably compared to last year, 13% overall. And that result multiplied by 1,000 is what gives us our mill rate. So our mill rate is actually down 8%, but this is just a function of the denominator in that calculation being so much bigger than last year. Okay, so this slide just breaks down the 2018 special levy by property type. And as you can see, if you're a residential or commercial property owner, your education taxes are actually decreasing this year. If you're a farmland property owner, your education taxes will be increasing approximately on average 14%. Here's a couple of examples. I won't go through line by line, but the key point is, maybe I'll take the residential example. If you're a residential property owner with property assessed at $150,000 in 2017, then your reassessed value in 2018 is about $160,000. Take 45% of that, multiply it by the mill rate, and then reduce it by the education property tax credit advance from the province, and you'll be paying $49 in education taxes, which is $13 less than you would have paid last year. Commercial property owners will pay about $115 less than they paid last year, and farmers will pay about $83 more on properties assessed at under these assumptions. So as Stephen mentioned, our process from here is that it's pushed back a week compared to last year. So if anyone has presentations that they would like to make to the board, please let us know, and we'll make time for that at the board's meeting on March 8th. The board does need to pass the budget no later than March 15th. That's the day that we have to send tax statements to all the municipalities, and on March 31st we have to advise the province of our budget. Any questions?
So we're actually monitoring YouTube to see if anyone had any questions. And someone asked a question, but they need to log in to ask the question. Do you want to tell me just what the question was? All right, so just to paraphrase, we have a question somebody posted on the YouTube stream. And they're just asking if the division's considered approaching outside agencies or organization for funding, perhaps for vocational programs or anything, I guess. We do that on a routine basis, not as much as some private sector groups, perhaps, or some other nonprofit organizations. Typically, we get funded what we need from the province and the local levy. I guess the climate is changing a bit. All of a sudden, we have school divisions like Brandon talking about possible partnerships, private partnerships to build schools, P3 schools. We have done some of that stuff. A lot of the resources that we have for vocational programs were accessed through additional funds. So use the cosmetology program, for example. In addition to the problem of shutting down a valuable program and telling the teacher that that teacher doesn't have a job next year, we have about $100,000 in resources and materials and equipment that's tied to the program. And all of those resources were purchased through grants and outside sources of funding. So we do it routinely, but I suspect we'll have to do it more frequently. And I'm not saying this jokingly, like if we'll be looking for our options in terms of funding different things. I can tell you through the leadership of one of our trustees last year, acting independent from her role as a trustee, Dana Kors, she sought to, Dana Kors is a former principal here. Dana Bartow, who's right over there, sought to get some support for Career Trek and We Day, and we'll look to do that, I guess, as a division more often. So I'm not sure if we do it at a high level now. I suspect it will be something that we'll look into more in the future. I'm going to wait for more questions. And they say sometimes you have to let silence do the heavy lifting. So take a minute to think about what you heard, and if there's anything that you need to know or you want to speak to, and it needn't be a question, you feel free to make a comment. But I'm going to just stop talking for a minute and give you a chance to think. Yep. All right. So that wasn't a planted question, but it's a good question, and we'll have it in our presentation next year. It used to be the case that school divisions, until this year, could get a grant called a tax incentive grant. And I think it was first introduced about 7 or 8 years ago. I'm not exactly certain, but it was sometime in that time frame. And basically, school divisions were given a challenge. If you could keep your tax level below 4% and your administration costs below 4%, you could get this grant. Basically, they give you a grant because you didn't increase costs to the taxpayer too much. So we've received the grant for several years. In fact, in this current school year, the tax incentive grant we got was $846,000, something like that, Drill? $817. One of the announcements that the province made this year was they're going to reduce that grant by 1/6 every year until it's gone in 6 years. Now, the interesting thing to note, though, is they reduced us by 1/6 of 817, but then they give it back to us as a small rural division in our formula guarantee. So it's likely that the bigger urban divisions are going to get stung the most, but to a large extent, because we, one of the trustees made this good point at a meeting recently, because our division was fiscally responsible and we kept our taxes low and kept our administrative costs low, we got a grant that other divisions didn't take. And there was many other divisions had high tax levels, generated lots of revenue, and we didn't. And now we're going to lose potentially the grant that we did received for that good fiscal responsibility. Does that answer it sufficiently? So, question from the audience, just the tax incentive grant that I just referenced, how much are they reducing? The province has said they're going to reduce it by 1/6 every year until it's phased out in 6 years. Sorry, Paulette? If you recall the second slide, I showed that next year we're projecting an enrollment decrease of 28.5. But the significant thing to note is our enrollment is pretty stable for the last 5 or 6 years. And a big reason for that is our partnership with Wayway-Scapa First Nation. So Paulette is a former trustee, and prior to the partnership with Wayway, Park West, like many rural school divisions, had a steady enrollment decline. And by putting pen to paper and having the agreement with Wayway-Scapa, we countered 12 years of depopulation. So our population, or our school enrollment, has hovered right around 2,100, 2,050 for the past 5 or 6 years. Very consistent. And the classes coming in future kindergarten classes seem to suggest enrollment will be steady. But in a given year, I mean, you can gain 20 or you can lose 20. You gain 20, you get a little bit more money potentially, and we lose 20, it hurts a little bit more. Question over here from Adam. All right, so that's a good question. So during the budget process, question from Adam Grabowski, can I identify you as the president of the local teacher association? He asked about the 2.55 cut in teachers that, we'll just leave it up there. That was showed at a school level, if that was what was communicated to schools when we originally planned for school budgets. So what I can tell you is I collected information, or John and I and the division collected information from school principals about what they thought they might need for next year for staffing. And then in the first 2 weeks after the Christmas break, we met with each principal for about an hour or so to talk about what their staffing proposal was and then what we were going to give them, and there was some negotiation. So as it stands right now with our proposed draft budget or proposed budget, those staffing levels are the same for schools. There's no change in school staffing based upon what we told principals in January. The one exception, however, is sometimes school divisions, and it has been fairly common practice in our division, we build in a little bit of flex time. So we had a half of teacher flex. That's kind of a teacher contingency. And on 180 teachers in the division, that's not that much. But what that allows us, if all of a sudden Birtle Elementary, which maybe has 18 kids in a combined class, all of a sudden that class is 28 because 10 kids in grade 3 and 4 moved there over the summer. We have a little bit of leeway to add staff to help that school out. We eliminated the contingency for next year. And we actually eliminated a lot of contingencies. And we had to make some tough decisions. I'll give you one practical example. The Manitoba Hydro is asking for a 7.9% increase in their utility rate. Some consumer agencies are saying it should be higher than 3. I think our budget has it about 4. So if it's only 3, we're fine. If it goes to 7.9, we'll have to make some adjustments. But most practical models and most people don't think, anyone but Manitoba Hydro believe it's going to be 7.9%. But even fuel contingencies, sometimes you build a little, 2 to 5% in case fuel costs and propane and diesel fluctuate. We've gone right down to the bare bones with a lot of those contingencies. I'm not sure where that came from. Any other questions? Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good question. So Adam Grabowski asked a question about the the healthcare aid teachers. So the way that worked is the school division covers the full cost of the programs. And that was a huge part of the appeal for kids. So kids could go through healthcare aid, get 6 high school credits, graduate from college, essentially for free. And as opposed to $15,000 to $20,000 perhaps if they stayed in Brandon and took the course for a year. However, even though they were ACC staff, the division paid for the staff. And they were kind of out of scope of our typical teacher. So we're reporting them there as teachers because they are vocational teachers. But a case could be made that they're not a typical classroom teacher as we generally define them. Okay, yeah. 0.55 is a little atypical, but it's because they get paid a little bit different than our regular classroom teacher. But the additional thing is the healthcare aid program runs for 1 hour a day for a semester. The kids take a course by online with a teacher delivering it from ACC. And then in second semester, and all our divisional vocational programs run full-time second semester. All right. Mr. Stainer, I think. I saw you confirmed on Facebook that you were coming. So, gentleman in the back just asked a question about if we were to sustain the vocational programs that we're projecting that are reduced or cut, reduced is not a good word, that are cut in the proposed budget, what would the implications be for the tax? What I have to say, unfortunately, is there can be no implications for the tax because the ceiling is 2%. We've already met it. But what I can tell you, it's about 1% for 200,000, Darrell. So it would be about a 1.8% increase in the special levy from 4% to 5.8. What I can tell you is when we first talked about that, it wasn't a specific, you must do this or else, but even when the minister made his announcement, a reporter said, what happens if a division doesn't do that? We'll have a conversation with that division. Darrell, our Secretary-Treasurer, connected with her colleagues from every division in Manitoba, and within a few days, 2 weeks ago, we found that 25 to 30 had already committed to not going above 2%. We only heard from a single division in the province that suggests they might go above 2, and they were going to contact and do public consultation to decide whether they could go as high as 3. We had a superintendent meeting on Friday for all the Westman superintendents in Brandon. Nobody's going near 2% because you don't want to be the division that's on the front page of the Free Press being called out by the Minister of Education. And even worse, we could say we're going to 6%, and then he could come and then we'll announce in the newspaper that we've talked to the minister and we're going to 2%. I suppose it would be a possibility, but in terms of budget changes, the reality that the board and the divisional administration is confronted with now is anything we contemplate adding from tonight till March 8th, we have to find the corresponding reduction in another area. That's the challenge. And what I can tell you, and I don't do this apologetically, it's the reality. We looked at every single budget line, every single divisional program, every single divisional staff member. What does that staff member cost? And basically, what's the cost-benefit return? So if there's things aren't cut, I can tell you that we contemplated cutting them because that was the nature of this budget. Bonnie? So the question from Bonnie Morris was about the proposed addition to the ICT position. That was 0.5 in the original budget this year, but we made it full-time. I suppose we did discuss that, Bonnie, but the big discussion about that took place in January, and we just kind of echoed that. There was a lengthy discussion and consultation and deliberation about whether or not that position should be full-time for the rest of the year. With the budget announcement, certainly we had to rethink it and talk about it, but we've invested so much in the technology infrastructure, we felt it was important to invest in the training of the people to use that infrastructure. And what I can tell you is we also, in addition to asking schools what you want in terms of staffing, we consulted with all schools and all department heads and asked them about what things should we include in the budget, what things should we consider taking out, what programs should we add, what programs should we take away. And two of the ones that we heard the most from people was almost every school indicated that we need this position to be full-time to support what we're trying to do in our classrooms. And about half our schools suggested that we need more maintenance time and more technician time in the ICT department, but unfortunately we weren't able to realize those things. So it wasn't an arbitrary decision of the board. It wasn't because we liked the position, but we're very happy with the position. We do like the position, but it was informed by consultation with our schools. Anyone else? I think that speaks to that fairly clearly. Lindsay. So Lindsay Kyle, principal of Burl Elementary, asked a question about the 3 hours proposed reduction per day for EA time. We allocate level 1 EA time by 1 hour per every 15 students in your school. So the number of students is less in our division by 28.5, and just because of efficiencies in certain buildings, we're able to reduce it by 3 hours. And just to give you context, 3 hours it's hard to get a sense of what that is. 5.5 hours is a full-time educational assistant. So 3 hours is more than half of an educational assistant. Lindsay? Yeah, absolutely. So Lindsay Kyle, Principal Burl Elementary, just asked a question about the 21,000 reduction in student services. A big portion of that is on the Wayway side of the budget. I think about 11 or 12,000 for OTPT, and the rest of it is kind of in the general operation budget for student services. Basically talking to the student service coordinator and saying, where could we find some efficiencies and some reductions just to help us deal with this budget. Don. So Don Yannick, you're a Reeve or mayor, Don? I just want mayor of Shoal Lake Municipality, arm of Yellowhead. I apologize. Yeah, I know. I live in Shoal Lake. I didn't realize I lived in Yellowhead until someone told me. So Don Yannick asked a question about would it be possible to fund the vocational programs through a grant, perhaps from the municipalities? I guess anything's possible. And I'll say this: we're not sitting here with our hats out. This is the budget we have, and this is the best scenario that we can imagine for next year. And again, our perspective was we wanted to minimize the impact on 2,100 kids and 180 teachers by unfortunately impacting a small number of teachers and a small number of students. But I suppose anything's possible. I can tell you that I'm involved with the golf club in Shoal Lake, or the arm of Yellowhead, and I know that they do give grants out because they helped us build a campground a couple of years ago. I don't think you'd have to pay for it all. I don't know how you do that calculation, Don. I'm sure it could be something that we could do, but we wouldn't even entertain it unless it was the will of the municipalities to even explore. what I would say is, whether through question or comment, if individual municipalities asked us to explore options, we'd be willing to look into stuff. So it wouldn't be out of the realm of possible that if a municipality said, what does this mean for the school division, or what might this mean for your budget? If we entertain questions, perhaps what we'll do is we'll do like a question and answer thing on our webpage. As questions come in or comments, we'll respond to them in a way that it's public for people to have a look at. And I don't know what the investigation would require for that question specifically, Don, but I mean, the fiscal realities change, so we're going to be willing to explore any option we might. So do you know what we're looking for, Drill? Yeah, Drill, do you want to just come up? Just apologize. We have a question and a discussion from Don Yannick with our Secretary Treasurer, and our Secretary Treasurer is just going to come and speak to it.
Yeah, so in total, all those programs together cost roughly $360,000. That's staffing costs plus busing of about $96,000 and supplies of roughly $40,000. So the staffing alone was about $223,000, I think the number was, plus busing costs of roughly $96,000, plus supplies costs of about $40,000. Our transportation manager said it's difficult to break out the cost to bus for each program because there's coming from different schools, coming to Birtle. So it's not to say it's impossible, but I don't have the busing cost per program. But if you want a rough estimate, take the 96,000 divided by 4, say roughly 25,000, 24,000 per program. So it's different because like Cosmo is a full-time FTE, whereas the other 3 programs are roughly 0.5 FTE. And a teacher salary and benefits is roughly $87,000 next year. I'd have to, yeah. I'm sorry, I don't know the population right off the top of my head. I'd have to do some digging, but I'm happy to do that. Okay.
We have that information already through our election, so we can get that information. So let me just ask a question. Whenever I'm in a group and a single person suggests something, I want to make sure it's more than one person is interested. I mean, we'll do that information just for Yellowhead if they're interested, but are there other municipalities that would be interested in that information? I want to be clear, don't walk away thinking that the division suggested that you need to do this because it's not anything we considered, but we're just responding to your comments. So I'm going to try as best I can to summarize that for people. How many people we still have connected? 25? All right. So just a comment from Councillor from Wallace Woodworth, is that correct? Just talking about how despite any empathy or compassion a municipal government might have for these programs that we're talking about potentially cutting, the question was raised, at what point does the downloading of this responsibility, and I'm trying to paraphrase, and this financial burden from the province to the divisions and the municipalities, at what point is that no longer feasible? And it'd be a question I'd be afraid to raise publicly outside of this room, because I think the province wants to hear people say that, because it may be their intent to fund school divisions completely separate from 100% funding from the province, but they're still going to tax you. You'll just have less say into it. There'll be no public consultation. They'll say this is what the tax is this year for the province. If anyone, I'm going to say this not because I'm tired of talking, but if anyone has anything that they want to say that they don't want me to risk paraphrasing inappropriately, I'm going to invite you to come up and grab a mic. Adam. All right? So Adam is asking a question about the middle years vocational program that we currently run for grade 8s in our division. For the schools that don't have vocational programs, we have 3 schools where there's vocational programs accessed by the students in the building: Wayway-Scapa First Nation, Major Pratt, and Burl Collegiate. All our other grade 8s from the division are bused to those sites for a half day a week for one semester. That was debated for a long time during the budget deliberation, but it survived that discussion, and it's still in the budget. But it's at the cost of about $41,000 to sustain those programs. But they're not cut. And it was basically, we just cut the high school opportunities for a lot of kids. Let's not take away the middle years opportunity. The additional thing I will say is, we do have a half-time vocational facilitator that's funded through a separate grant from the province, and she's a full-time person that works with us in Mountain View. She's still going to be there to support small schools with apprenticeship and work placement, but it's those 4 divisional programs. If you have a school like Burtle Collegiate or Major Pratt, where you have shops and metals and home ec, those things aren't affected. That's just part of the regular staffing. So I'm glad I made that point, because someone today, when I was speaking with them, thought we were cutting high school vocational programs in buildings where they had their own standalone programs. That is not the case. Other questions or comments? Colleen. No, I don't think so. Yeah, the only $15,000. So Colleen Clearsky, the education director from Wayway, asked about a $15,000 reduction on Wayway. It's in the bursaries. That would have been, we do a budget with Wayway. We have a divisional team that meets with the Wayway team separately to develop their budget. And that was one of the things that was identified as a reduction in their budget. The only other budget reduction in that number, Colleen, would be the OTPT, the occupational physical therapy. And that was also cut during our partnership budgeting process. Absolutely. So, as I said earlier, we'll stay and talk to you as long as you have questions. And if some of you are more comfortable just coming up and asking us questions, feel free to do so. Tentatively, we have, oh, go ahead, Bonnie. Absolutely. Good question. So the question is, have we done any conversation about cutting board members? We had significant conversation during this budget process about the potential for reducing board members. And we're going to hear from some divisions, many divisions across Manitoba, particularly Western Manitoba, had the same conversation. I'm aware of a couple of divisions that are tentatively planning it, but it's not official until their public budget meeting. At the end of the day, at the end of the process, our board chose not to do that this year. No, we have 10 trustees, 9 that were inherited through amalgamation, and we have 1 special designate for the trustee from Wayway-Scapa. You're asking for the total budget for the trustee line. I'll look at Darrell, who I think can speak to that. So the question I'm responding to is if we considered reducing the number of trustees and what the budget for the trustees is.
Yeah, just going from memory, I think it's about $177,000 for all trustee costs. So that's their indemnities, insurance, mileage, PD, all their costs.
So the math is fairly simple. Each trustee is $17,000 in our current budget. Go ahead, Adam. Do you want the mic up in front to say it? All right. So Adam Grabowski, our local association president and parent, gave his perspective. I'm not going to try to summarize. He spoke quite loudly, so I suspect you probably heard it, but basically Adam made a case for advocacy at a community level and a parental level about the impact of the proposed school funding on school divisions and students. I'm not going to say that because I'm the superintendent with a mic, and this is going to be archived on YouTube. But someone did from the audience suggest that you contact your MLAs, but that came from the audience, of course. Any other questions before I wrap it up? Oh, go ahead, Paulette, and then the gentleman in the back. So, trustee, or I apologize, a counselor from the RM of Yellowhead, Paula Crossell, if you didn't hear her, she just spoke about, echoed Adam's point about the need for advocacy and how some of these reductions will have an impact and disadvantage rural school divisions. Is that a fair summary? Gentleman in the back. So the question was, what might the potential impact on our student enrollment be if those vocational programs don't run? What I can tell you is we have allowed non-high school students in the program, but in this current year, of the approximately 60 students that are enrolled in the program, only one of them is not a high school student. So those kids would have been in high school anyway. Unfortunately, they would have been taking something else, or you could make an argument that for those kids that really need vocational programs, perhaps that would put their attendance at risk. I'm not sure if that's what you're suggesting, but we didn't account for that. Basically, we assumed that those students would return. Yeah, so the point from Mr. Oliver was that there's a potential loss of students if the vocational programs aren't there to meet their needs. It's interesting, when I'm checking, just prior to the meeting starting, I was checking Facebook to see how many people confirmed that were coming. A parent, and it was quite timely, but a parent from Shoal Lake posted a picture of a construction worker and said something about vocational programs, and not all kids are going to be doctors or lawyers. So I'm going to call the principal tomorrow and say, like, it's kind of coincidental that she posted that, given our presentation today at the noon hour. But it's just a parent of a kid that values vocational programs. And there's lots of parents like that. I mean, as much as anyone, we had a team of divisional people and staff and students and community members that put together these vocational programs. My daughter's in grade 9. When she was in grade 6, I told her, you can decide which one, but you're taking one of these vocational programs when you get to grade 11 or grade 12. Because she's a kid that would benefit from those programs. And I'd kind of secretly in my mind hoped that she would pick healthcare aid, just because maybe give her some other options beyond, and kind of aligned with the things that she was interested in. I'm going to tell her tomorrow night about what we're talking about tonight, which is really unfortunate. So it's going to have a personal impact on a lot of us. Don. Yeah, and given your DSFM is a good point of reference, so Don Cochran, one of the trustees, asked about if there's any students from the DSFM school in St. Lazare that come to our division for the programs. Typically, we get 1 or 2 a year from DSFM. We charge them a prorated share of like 1 semester attendance. This year, we had a student from DSFM that was going to join us for cosmetology, but they didn't. And I'm not sure about construction, John. I don't think we have any. So it's actually an aberration. We have one from DSFM. So if there's no construction, we'd lose $4,000 or $5,000 that we charge that student. So lost revenue, certainly. Thanks for your help, Stacy. Allison, question in the back? So a parent in the back, and I think she spoke loud enough that you may have picked it up, but echoed the comments that we've heard already about the value of our divisional vocational programs and the potential negative impact on our students and communities if they're removed. And the parent also mentioned concern about the loss of staffing in the local school as a result of the vocational programs being reduced. What I can tell you is there was tremendous debate about a lot of these topics. This one was extended over 3 weeks talking about these big ones. And unfortunately, in a consensus model, ultimately the board chair would say, all right, how many people are in favor of the proposed reduction to vocational? fortunately, it was unanimous, but to a T, everyone raised their hand and said, I'm voting for this, but I'm against it. I'm voting for this, but I'd hate to see our vocational programs go. I'm voting for this, but it sucks that I'm voting for this. So that's kind of what we're confronted with. I guess one additional thing, and whether it's advocating for programs or not, I'm just speaking to this one individually, but not trying to elevate it over the others. I talked about the savings that kids experience when they take these vocational programs locally. I don't think it's unfair or unreasonable to suggest it's in the $10,000 to $15,000 range for healthcare aid. We floated 60 kids through that program in 4 years. What's the loss to our local economy when those kids spend their money directly to ACC for tuition, room and board, those kind of things? But we know that with all of them. I mean, we've had already 6 kids, and I say kids because they're students, right? I apologize if anyone takes offense. But 6 students that have completed the cosmetology program and left it with 0 debt and 0 money out of pocket. And then they can go into industry, work for a year, and then they're hairstylists, or 1,500 hours, or however it works. So definitely, none of these things were easy decisions, and some of them you may not even know what minus 10,000 means there, but they were all difficult decisions, but the big ones are the ones that definitely we struggled with the most. Any other questions or comments? So I'll encourage you, anyone that wants to stay, please stay and engage anyone you'd like in conversation. Just to reiterate the process, we have a budget meeting, we have a board meeting scheduled for next Thursday, where typically we approve the budget for the following year. We are about 2 weeks behind in terms of the announcement from the province, or at least a week and a half behind. We will entertain public presentations next Thursday. We have it scheduled from 4:30 to 6. Typically they're 20 minutes, but if we have more, we'll extend it. The additional thing is it's well within the prerogative of the board to decide that next Thursday they need more time to think about it, in which case we'll probably schedule a meeting for the 13th or 14th. I can't say that's going to be the case. It depends on the way the deliberations go and what additional information we have to consider. But the timeline is tight. Before last year, we never received the provincial funding announcement any later than January 30th. This year, there was a rumor that we weren't going to get it until the 15th of February. We got it on the 8th of February. So that's why this meeting tonight was delayed a week, and that's why we're under a little bit of pressure, because we have an obligation to get the information to the ratepayers and municipalities by the 15th, and we have to submit our budget to the province by the 31st. So if you're able to make a presentation, if that's something that you're interested, call the school division office, and myself or Tanya Thompson, our executive assistant, will give you information about that. If you want to give feedback, if you want to call and talk to one of us, if you want to send an email, feel free to do so. And we look forward to any feedback you might give. And I know some of you are representing yourself, and others may perhaps are representatives from municipalities. As quickly as you can, get the information back to your colleagues. The information is public as of now, and what I will note is the majority of people that we hear feedback from about the budget are people that don't attend to this meeting. Because other people will look at the presentation online, or the 25 people that are viewing this online will give us some feedback. So I'll just say thank you very much for coming out. I'm just going to hand it over to our board chair to give closing remarks.
Thank you so much for all the great discussion, and thank you again for coming on behalf of the board, and thank you to Stephen and John and Darrell for your leadership and all your hard work, and to my fellow trustees for all the challenges. And you know, we have the opportunity to work together as communities. We are rural communities, and I think the advocacy is a really important part right now. So please feel free to come to the board, and we're really open to your input after this evening. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Jason.